Trigger warning! I'm about to describe a bunch of really disturbing stuff that happens in the seminal, worldwide beloved Berserk manga. I can't really show you any of it, and wouldn't really want to subject you to it before you were curious about it anyways, plus I couldn't put any of that stuff on YouTube. But I also am going to spend this video attempting to justify and explain the presence of this content in the manga. My intent isn't to defend the content per se, because if it offends you or you don't like it, I think those are rational and defensible reactions in and of themselves. There is no wrong reaction to have to a story other than campaigning to have it banned. But I think it's important to understand the perspectives of people who feel differently about aspects of a story to yourself as well. In this video, I will be focusing specifically on two pairs of pages that have been particularly controversial in discussion surrounding the series and which have driven me to think about them continually for more than a decade since first reading the manga. One of these is a moment that I don't particularly like, in the sense that I think Miura-san probably would have done it differently if given a second chance because it doesn't work for the story, but I'm still going to try to justify it for what I think it was intended to do at the time. The other is a moment that I love in the sense that it instilled so much emotion in me that I can't possibly forget about it as an iconic scene from manga, even if many of those emotions were difficult to experience. The first of these few page scenes I'll be analyzing is the very first pages of the manga, in which Guts the Black Swordsman is having sex with a woman who transforms into a demon, and so he calls her a bitch and blows her head up with an arm cannon. It's a brusque, hyper-masculine, edgy, over-the-top, and most damningly kind of generic opening to a hard-ass dark action fantasy story of the era. It feels like the start of a Kawajiri Yoshiaki film or a Koike Takeshi manga, and is very obviously meant to set a specific tone that establishes the identity and character of the story in one fell swoop. The appeal of the manga was originally supposed to be most essentially about awesome artwork of a dude destroying huge monsters with really cool weapons, and the context for that violence seems concocted to be as shocking and instantly gratifying as possible. It's only because this scene has turned out not to gratify so much of the audience who eventually fell in love with the manga that I think it's become a talking point over time. In his recent video, Why You Should Still Read Berserk, Super Eyepatch Wolf does a great job of explaining why the first 3 volumes of Berserk are the way that they are, and how they aren't necessarily all that good compared to the story that we're going to get starting with Guts' backstory at the end of the 3rd volume. I more or less agree with the points that he made, and I would even add that my personal biggest criticism of how the manga starts is simply that the more nuanced character Guts would end up being established as in the Golden Age arc couldn't possibly be the same guy that he was supposed to turn into going by the first 3 volumes, and he clearly isn't that guy when the 10-volume backstory is over and we get back to the present following Guts in the wake of what he had supposedly done at the start. These opening pages are kind of the worst part of the whole beginning section, specifically because a huge part of Guts' emotional arc in the manga involves his total unwillingness to share his touch with anyone after being sexually assaulted in his childhood. Berserk is as much a story specifically about sexual violence and trauma as it is about anything else when it becomes the amazing character study that the rest of the show unfolds into. Because of that, I do think that the opening pages made a kind of sense as the way that Berserk begins. But since Miura-sensei would figure out how to deal with this subject in endlessly more nuance over the course of the story, it's hard to imagine that he would have chosen to start the story the same way if he could have reset it. Which is why, as far as I'm concerned, the real first pages of Berserk's story are that of Guts' birth underneath the hanged woman amid a treeload of corpses. It's actually kind of unbelievable to me that none of the Berserk adaptations chose to open with that. It's easy to view the opening pages of Berserk as they stand as simply trashy, but I think it's worth investigating what that scene actually seems to be saying when you put yourself into its state of mind. In the first panel, Guts is completely naked, doing what ought to be the most unguarded, intimate thing that you can do with another person. He's even next to a campfire, with the swirl of the flames, the darkness, and the sound effects of the girl's moans forming a kind of blanket around them. Consider that the first panel shows almost none of the woman's body, but displays Guts' entire unguarded backside, ass cheek detail and all. The second panel has the girl looking kind of sexy and sort of wrapping herself around his metallic left arm, and in neither of the the panels can we really see the characters' expressions, only their bodies, and we compare Guts' huge, muscular, scar-ridden frame with his clearly severed arm against her petite, pleasant frame and what seems like a generically cutesy kind of 80s style face. That face immediately morphs, and by the fourth panel is starting to look like H.R. Geiger's Alien, with a phallic tongue protruding forth as she totally morphs into her true form. Whether Guts saw this coming or not, we can't be sure, since we only now have a clear shot of his upset expression as the creature transforms into something horrifying, whose arm is reaching over to Guts' backside in the fourth panel, with emphasis on how its arm has grown longer and more tightly muscular even than his. The next two-page spread feels like something right out of an H.R. Geiger art book, as the demon has completely enshrouded Guts. And just look at his pose if you're looking at the pages while I talk about them. I don't know a polite way to frame that Guts looks like he's about to be mounted for anal sex, and all of the demon's extremities have encompassed him. Additionally, its hair has turned into an explosion of tentacles, tendrils, hands, and wings, with that ever huger tongue threatening Guts' face, and even tendrils from its neck approaching his neck. "You fell into my trap, you fool," the demon bellows on the fourth page, and wraps its legs around Guts, pushing him deeper inside of it to emphasize the fact that this was a sexually devised trap. "This is your last taste of heaven before I send you to hell," the monster says as it licks his face, as if implying that Guts should still be enjoying this. Guts then does the only thing that would indeed satisfy him at this moment and shoves his arm cannon into the monster's mouth and says, "The only one trapped is you, bitch," and blasts the demon. It's worth noting, though, that we don't actually even see the kill shot, just a sound effect over a landscape shot before we see Guts putting on a cape, glancing back with an expression of clear discomfort and dismay, and then leaving the dusted corpse behind him. The undercurrent of this entire scene is completely wrong if it was supposed to be a gratifying scene about a badass character doing something cool. All of the imagery here is basically to implicate that Guts was raped in this scene. He attempted sexual contact with someone whose intention turned out to be to literally consume him, and he was forced to destroy them. And while he projects a smug satisfaction and anger at the moment of putting an end to the demon, we clearly see afterward that he's not exactly glowing over what just happened. I'm not sure really if there's a more accessible way to open a manga with the main character getting sexually assaulted while still being, accessible to guys who want to read a badass fantasy story about a cool dude with an arm cannon. Nevertheless, I don't think the scene is necessarily good. I think its intentions ended up reading weirdly, especially with the crass expression that Guts uses when he blows the demon away, even though the uncomfortable panel on the next page is much less often noticed by readers. The opening image of the Golden Age does a much better job of setting us up with a broad palette of suggestion to build on, which includes sexual violence without being so direct about it. The first image is just a dead tree hung with bodies and popular with crows, looking as bluntly gothic and dismal as it possibly could. This image alone, I think, has inspired so much of From Software's environmental design that it must have had a serious impact on a lot of people who saw it, including myself. A campaign of warriors approaches the tree in the following panels and finds a baby in the mud, freshly bloody, implying that the infant had literally fallen out of a dead woman's womb, and the umbilical cord severed by the fall. It is impossible to imagine a shittier, more hopeless way to be born, and we will quickly learn why dying in the dirt would have been a lot easier for Guts than the life that he would be subjected to after being taken in by these mercenaries. We don't know anything about Guts' parents or what led to his birth, but the invocation of birth is an invocation of sex, and contextually it's in the least appealing light imaginable, to the point that it couldn't be further from the mind in this scene that reeks so heavily of death, as fully articulated in the next two-page spread. So that was the first bit I wanted to discuss, but the other one is a final and a first page of two certain chapters that have recently re-shocked a number of readers to find out about it, and can seem like one of the most senseless displays of over-the-top edgy violence in the entire series. Even defending this is going to require me to describe some really fucked up feelings, but I've been burning to talk about this for years because my reaction to it was so intense. Around midway into the Band of the Hawk arc, we meet a party of mostly pretty generic-seeming demons raping and pillaging their way through the battlefields with pretty reckless abandon. At the end of one chapter, there's a full-page spread of the Demon Brigade's leader raping a gorgeous young princess while carrying a gigantic sword over his shoulder with a guy's torso impaled on it, and wearing just the biggest fucking smile on his face. The very next page at the start of the next chapter has that demon riding into battle with all his mates, carrying the princess's completely delimbed torso on the end of his weapon. It's incredibly graphic and intense imagery for sure, probably more than any other popular media I can think of, honestly. And a lot of Berserk readers, I think, are so taken aback by imagery like this that they just kind of try to blow past and forget about it. And yet, when I picture Berserk in my mind, a lot of the very first things I think of are the rape scenes, because yeah, they were incredibly haunting and horrifying and forced me to face something I never wanted to have to think about, but I did think about it. And eventually the pages I just described in particular created an epiphany in me that kind of made me all at once understand what the point of monster rape as a category of artwork, pornographic or otherwise, is. What initially had made this moment such a gut punch for me is that Miura-sensei went out of his way to give this princess an exceptionally gorgeous character design. This girl could have been one of the main characters of another show, and in this manga she exists pretty much just for the sake of getting completely destroyed in a display of this demon's cruelty. Just the thought that this artist could devalue something that I might hold in such high regard as a beautifully conceived anime character was painful for me at the time, and then I realized that's exactly the point. In a way, I think this image qualifies as NTR. I don't remember if the guy on the sword was supposed to be the princess's boyfriend or the lead knight or something, or if I just made all that up at the time that I spent thinking about this page, but it gives off that energy of, I just blew past your man like he was nothing, and now I'm using you like you're nothing too. And that's when I realized something. This demon isn't even actually looking at this girl at all. He's really just kinda howling into the air with satisfaction, talking to someone else about what they're gonna do next, as if this particular conquest was basically just a warm-up to a bigger and better bloodlust. This demon does not regard its actions in the same way that a human would. To this demon, humans are basically just cum socks you can also eat for breakfast. It means nothing to him who this woman is or even how beautiful she is. It's just an object that can be used to satisfy his immediate desires for sexual gratification and bloodshed, and is otherwise completely disposable, because this demon can always just rip through another village and find another beautiful princess to rape and eat in just a couple of hours. The real horror of this scene isn't the fact of what's happening, but the casualness with which the demon indulges the scenario, and his insistence on his intention to continue creating similar scenarios constantly until someone puts him to a stop, which seems like it would be completely impossible for almost anyone that we've seen in the series so far who would have any reason to try. In the course of my time on the internet and as an anime fan investigating the furthest fringes of the medium and culture, I've pretty deeply desensitized myself to shock at seeing images of extreme sexual violence, and I feel a certain level of sympathy towards its existence as a means of processing emotional reactions to an incredibly terrifying world. When I get depressed, I have a tendency to draw a lot of girls with no arms and legs doing things like vomiting or being fed to giant fish, and while I don't really know what emotions, if any, those images inspire in the people who see them, I know that they help me to move past my negative feelings by turning them into something creative and cool, in something that might even scare me into feeling less shitty just by looking at it. Finding that there can be some aesthetic quality of emotional resonance drawn out of those negative feelings that normally just sit festering inside of me is a powerful means of releasing them from me. Berserk is replete with haunting and disturbing moments, but it seems like audiences are very differently inspired by which images stick in their subconscious. A lot of readers will focus on the softer, epic fantasy imagery of the later manga, or the apocalyptic horror of the eclipse, all of which I greatly appreciate as well. But to me, the exploration of sexual violence and the emotions behind it on the part of both the victims and the evildoers is one of the most potent aspects of Berserk, specifically because it dives into that imagery so much more elaborately and with more thought and intention behind it than any other story I've ever seen that I would categorize as erotically grotesque. Among all of the things that Berserk is, it needs credit for being among the greatest explorations of eroguro in art history, even if that means opening up extremely difficult conversations like this one that I've been putting off for years looking for the right angle of approach, and only getting it when Super Eye Patch Wolf reminded me about the first pages and got me thinking about them. If you've got the stomach to explore eroguro in more depth, I recommend my recent Anime Alphabet video about the seminal 90s samurai action horror classic Jubei Ninpucho or Ninja Scroll. Are there any disturbing scenes from Berserk that stick out in your mind as something meaningful to you? Find more of my writing on goldenwitch.substack.com and support me on patreon.com/goldenwitchfire, which is also my name on all social media and payment platforms. Thanks again for watching, and never forget, anime forever.